Good morning or good afternoon. I am Ramayad, Senior Director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. With our partner, the Policy Center for the New South, the largest think tank in Africa, we convene today a unique event on the new trends of African migrations, a very sensitive topic, but critically important for the future of international relations. Before starting, I would like to stress two biases I noticed when it comes to African migrations. First, Africa remains underpopulated, and compared to Europe, which has a much higher population density. Two, Western countries are not the first destination for African immigrants. When they migrate, many prioritize a neighboring African country. The immigration of Africans is first and foremost intra-African. Yet immigration has never been without tensions. In Europe, the rise of far-right parties over the past 20 years has culminated in them becoming a major political force in the European Parliament ahead of the June 2024 elections. In the United States, it remains a contentious issue that now more than ever dominates election campaigns with the battles around the wall constructed on the US-Mexico border. The tension around immigration has grown in light of the projected doubling of the African population by 2030. This demographic trend is raising fears in a part of Europe that is already dealing with the tragedies of African migration in the Mediterranean. In the United States, the decline of the population identifying as white from a level of 80% 40 years ago to 57% of the overall population is also the subject of heated political debate. What does African migration mean today? How has it evolved in terms of flows, of nature, of origins, and destinations? How are African immigrants perceived in the host countries? Moroccans in France and Nigerians in the US, in UK, in South Africa. Our event will also offer the opportunity of a report launch, Migration Dynamics in the Atlantic Basin, Case Studies from Morocco and Nigeria. That is the title of this important report. I would like to thank Amal Ouassif and Constance Newman, both senior fellows at the Policy Center for the New South and the Atlantic Council for their remarkable work available on the Atlantic Council website. Constance and Amal will present their key findings and recommendations today in a conversation moderated by Benjamin Mosberg, Deputy Director of the Africa Center. This presentation will be followed by a high-level expert panel I would be pleased to moderate. But before that, allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor François Héran. I met Professor Héran in 2019 here in Washington, D.C., where he was the guest speaker of our colleagues of Brookings and then of the French Embassy. The important crowd that welcomed each of his appearances gives you a clear idea of his well-established reputation in the world. It is an honor to welcome Professor Héran, Chair of Migration and Societies at the Collège de France.
Pleased to make this intervention for the Atlantic Council. First of all, many thanks to Madame Ramayad for this warmful invitation. Let's begin immediately with the facts, because I think we need to get back to the facts. Yes, there is a lot of fears about African migrations due to the fact that all the demographic prospects were published by the United Nations explain us that, yes, within up to 2050, the number of people living in Africa will double. And if we consider that at least in the African populations, there will be a constant propensity to emigrate in the next decades. Of course, this means also a doubling of the number of emigrants from Africa to Europe, for example, or to the United States. In fact, it's a little more complicated than that, because Africa has not a very elevated a very high propensity to emigrate. We know that most of the African migrations are internal migration or intra-African migration. That is, people from sub-Saharan Africa, for example, when they migrate abroad, migrate in 70% of the cases migrate to another country, also sub-Saharan country, sub-Saharan region. The situation is different with Maghreb because the problem with Maghreb and even the tragedy with Maghreb is the fact that the three countries are compartmented. The borders are closed. There is no free circulation between the three countries of Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. So when the people from this sub-region want to improve their conditions, their life conditions, they have to migrate overseas, and mainly in Europe. What we observe, so there is a huge contrast between the Maghreb pattern of migrations and the sub-Saharan pattern of migration. Within the sub-Saharan region, there are a certain number of treaties on free circulation. It is important, I think, for the European diplomacy to encourage these free circulation treaties because I think that the future of Africa is certainly in the development of a free circulation within Africa. And if we take into account the projections based on the United Nations estimated population growth, under the hypothesis of a constant propensity to emigrate, we see that the number of immigrants outside an African country, presently 46 million persons, more or less, should be in 2050 74, something like that. Not exactly a doubling, but this will not make Africa the first continent of emigration. Asia is still much more important, at least the double of African population, because it is at least, well, as we know, a populated continent. And whereas Latin America will, of course, stagnate. So I think that the real panic we have about African migration in Europe is completely exaggerated. We are struck by images, media images, for example, all these African people disembarking in Lampedusa in Italy. But Italy is a sort of highway with only one entry opened. And it's not surprising that sometimes there are a bottleneck, which is very spectacular. There is a zooming effect in the vision we have of African migration. But finally, the emigration rate of Africa is not that high. If you compare it, for example, with the Balkan countries, so the ex-communist, former communist countries of Southeastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and so on, more than 20% of this region of the world live abroad, which is much higher than Africa. And nobody talks about this phenomenon. So I think that especially in this moment of crisis, a huge crisis in France and beyond France in all Europe about immigration is in period of a rising xenophobia. We should, stress the importance of establishing good numbers, establishing objective numbers, objective quantitative estimates from one side, and to fight in a much more combative way all discrimination issue, which is certainly underestimated in France. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rama, and thank you very much, Professor Errand. I'd like to turn now to talk about a joint research and analysis effort by the Policy Center for the New South, Morocco's leading think tank, and the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, titled Migration Dynamics in the Atlantic Basin, Case Studies from Morocco and Nigeria. I'm joined today by report authors Amal Ouassif, Senior International Relations Specialist from the Policy Center for the New South, and Constance Newman, a former senior US government official who served in many roles, including as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs at the State Department, and who now calls the Africa Center home as a non-resident senior fellow. Amal, Constance, welcome. I'd like to jump right in, following along the lines of what Professor Errand spoke about. The research and analysis in the report, which you can find on our website or via the QR code on your screen, looks into Nigeria and Morocco as different case studies. In 2 minutes or so, Amal and Constance, please walk us through why you chose this specific country, who's leaving the country, where they're going, and what conditions do they face when they get there. Amal, let me start with you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and the Policy Center for the New South for this very interesting initiative to write about the trends of African migration through the cases of Moroccan migrants and Nigerians. As far as the choice of the study cases is concerned, I can only speak about the case of Morocco. It's a country where there is a very important number of migrants going abroad. And Professor Francois has just mentioned it very brightly. For the case of Maghreb countries, most of the migration that happens is actually overseas, mainly to European countries. And I chose to work on the case of Morocco, first of all, because I know it very well. I've been working on migration for the past 8 years, so I know really well the topic, and also because of the relevance of this topic. Morocco is actually the most dynamic when it comes to migration from the Maghreb countries. Just to give you an idea, there is about 5 million Moroccans who are currently residing abroad, according to the last numbers of the Moroccan High Commission for Planning, for a population of 36.7 million. So we commonly used to call them as the 13th region of Morocco because of their importance and also of the importance of the remittances that they send back. In terms of the profile we're talking about, it's mainly a migration that happens among male migrants. They are the predominant category, with over 68% of Moroccan migrants who are male migrants. So women, although there is an increase in feminization of migration, female migrants remain to be more as accompanying their husbands and partners to go abroad, but not the principal actors of migration. It's also a relatively young migration, where we find most migrants aged between 15 and 29. And this is very logical, because even when you look at the reports of the IOM, it still remains that economics drivers are the main motivations for people to migrate. This is why they typically fall in the demographic category of actively working population. When it comes to destinations, we witness an increase in diversification in the destination of Moroccan migrants, but they remain really predominantly faithful to the traditional destination of migration, like France, Spain, Belgium, Italy. For instance, only France has, according to the last figures, more than 1,050,000 Moroccans who are currently residing in France. And that is based on the study that is conducted by the High Commission of Planning for Morocco, that actually surveyed more than 15,000 households with both current and returning migrants. And they found out that the main drivers are still economic drivers looking for better opportunities, although we witness more movement also among the students who would like to have higher education in European countries, mainly France, because actually the highest number of international students who are currently living in France are Moroccans. And regarding your last question, what kind of challenges that are faced by those migrants abroad? And since we're focusing on the case of Moroccans who live in France, I can only tell you that it's a variety of complex factors that these migrants are faced with. Of course, we cannot generalize for all Moroccan migrants, but a large share of them are actually faced with some barriers to access the labor market and also to access the some other public services. I'm mentioning here a study that was conducted by an institute on the discrimination that is faced by Northern African migrants to access the labor market. And they actually used a screening methodology with over 2,400 job postings, real job postings, where they actually had Maghrebi migrants having the same resume as French citizens, and they were applying for the same job. And surprisingly, the people from migratory background got 4 times less responses than the French their French counterparts for the same level of qualifications. This is only an example of the multiple discrimination that they are faced with when it comes to accessing the labor market, to other services like housing, and also to schools. And this is really it's interesting to look at it from the framework of the intersectionality theory, because there are a lot of most of the times there are layers of discrimination. So it depends on where the person is living, first of all, in their neighborhood. It conditions what kind of education they are getting, and afterwards, what are their chances to access the labor market and to benefit from other services. I think I will stop here because you mentioned 2 minutes, but I'll gladly elaborate more on any given specific point if you would like to further in the discussion.
Amal, I think your example is perfect. I do want to turn to Constance here to answer the same kinds of questions. Why Nigeria? Who's leaving? Where are they going? And what have they found when they've gotten there?
So why Nigeria? Why not Nigeria? Because Nigeria is has the largest population on the continent. The youth take up about that's under 43% of the population. 69% of Nigerians surveyed indicated to the Africa Polling Institute that they would like to relocate out of the country. So already there's the problem in Nigeria of the next generation indicating that they want to leave. And another reason why we chose Nigeria is that Nigerians who leave and go to Chicago, London, South Africa, are major contributors to remittances. So the country loses and gains as a result of migration. And we're just kind of interested in seeing, though, what is the connection of the problems in the country and the benefits of the country of the people actually leaving.
You talk about the word Japa in your report.
Japa is a very interesting Yoruba word that means panic, fleeing with panic. And that's what's really thought of by the youth. They're more worried about staying than leaving, and they're thinking of ways in which they can leave, be educated, they can leave and get jobs, because what we find with the Nigerians who come to places like Chicago, or go to London, that they are actually very successful and successful in getting high-level positions because they're among the most educated of the immigrants into the U.S. and into London.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Nigerian community is the embodiment of the American dream, or has the ability to try to achieve the American dream, I want to turn to you, Amal, and see is there a French equivalent to the American dream? You know, if immigrant communities are facing some of the challenges that you've mentioned and highlighted in this report, why is it so difficult for the receiving countries to absorb these communities and to make them a part of society?
actually, there are a lot of sides to your question, and if I want to give the short answer, is of course I cannot really be confident in saying that there is an equivalent to the American dream in France because of all of what's happening and also the rise of populism in France. But to give the question its share of context, it is important to mention that France has for long been a nation that has hosted a lot of migrants, but just the motivations and the nature of migration has changed because the first waves of Moroccans who arrived actually in France, they were low-skilled people working in the construction after the Second World War II. So a given specific category that was not meant to remain there or to be established in the country. But afterwards, and because also we have to keep in mind that when we are talking about migration, it's a human phenomena. You cannot really trace or plan how a migratory journey could go on. So these people, they stayed in France and they ended up bringing also their families. So there was probably not an anticipation of what France wanted to make out of migration. And this is where we started to see this kind of difficulties that emerged in the French society because of the difference in culture, because also of the difference in the generations of migrants who are currently living in France. But we can differentiate between the old generation of migrants and their children who face some difficulties in terms of culture and in terms of integration in the host country. And there are recently new waves of migration that is more selective. I'm specifically mentioning the example of engineers who actually are very encouraged to come to France, and they're given all sorts of easy processes so that they could be established in the country. So their experiences are relatively better in terms of achieving their objectives. And of course, there are also the students who have a specific status and who are also better off when it comes to migration. This is from the side of really external factors that has not necessarily led to an ideal outcome when it comes to achieving the French dream, if it might exist. But also, I think that we can also have a critical eye on the model of integration that France is pursuing, that was for long characterized by so many researchers as assimilation. Some of them disagree with the word, because I think that France as a nation has really a strong emphasis on identity, on the core values of the republic, that sometimes prevent or doesn't give enough room for diversity, for the migrants actually to keep their identity and also contribute to the whole or to the general identity of the country. If I only compare, for instance, my experience living in the US for 1 year as an exchange student, and also frequently going to France and having friends who are established in France, I think that it's also about the choices that are made by the top management and the government of each country between two different integration models. One that is based on really having and keeping the identity of the republic and the core values of the republic, and that everyone has to kind of be adhering to these values. And another model that has known since the beginning that it's a nation that is also built on migration and that welcomes the diversity of all migrants as long as they fit into the laws and regulation of the country. I think that this is the biggest difference between the two models.
And I think that that's what makes the two case studies so interesting, is that there is such a difference in context there. But we're coming to the end of this first segment. Amal, before I turn away from you, in 30 seconds, can you tell me, in your view, what are the two main takeaways from your report? If I'm an immigration skeptic, what should I take away from this report?
I would say is actually having more an openness of spirit when it comes to discussing the question of migration, no stereotypes when it comes to understanding what's actually going on, and knowing that we have to make efforts both as sending and host countries to really work out on ways and models of integration that could be in the benefit of the host and the sending country.
Thank you, Amal. Constance, we're here in the studio, we're hearing all this, we're setting the stage for an expert discussion here. If I have your report in front of me, what are the two main takeaways that I need to have in my mind as I listen to the next segment and as I read the report in full, which you can find on our website or on the QR code on your screen?
So even though it sounds rosy, there are problems in terms of the migration of Nigerians, both to the United States, to London, and particularly to South Africa. There are problems. And so what that means is there's a need for greater coordination between the losing and the gaining countries. Mm-hmm. And there's more work for the embassies and the consulates to try to get a better system.
And international organizations.
And the international. And speaking of international organizations, what I also, and I'm not sure everybody agrees with this, but I ran USAID Africa. So I'm a big demonstration person, and I think it would be very useful to have a major demonstration on how to work with immigrating communities and how to build up the opportunity for the youth, because whether people want them to move or not, they are in fact moving, and at a greater speed than I think anyone intended. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a need to communicate better about what the problems are and what the potential solutions are, which is why I'm wedded to demonstrations, because storytelling is usually a more convincing way of getting people to change. And so I leave you with saying, yes, it's good, and no, it's not good. Okay.
Thank you, Constance. Thank you, Amal, for walking us through your report. For our audience here in the studios, for our audience at home, please visit our website to find all of our recent reporting, including the opportunity to download the full version of this report, Migration Dynamics in the Atlantic Basin, Case Studies from Morocco and Nigeria. Bear with us for a few moments as we transition segments. Please don't leave us. We've got a fabulous expert discussion coming right up. Thank you.
It was a delight to hear from Amal and Constance the key findings and recommendations from their report under the excellent moderation by Ben Mossberg. Now we are going to open the doors and the windows with this high-level expert panel. I'm pleased to introduce Osayi Imasoji, inaugural member of the President Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement in the United States. Welcome, Osayi. Dr. Andrew Seeley, President of Migration Policy Institute. Welcome. And Dr. Lara Smith, Associate Professor, African Studies Program and Department of Government at Georgetown University. Welcome too. So I just would like to start by asking you, what did you feel about this report? What about this conversation you just hear? What are your first comments? Dr. Laura Smith.
Sure. You know, professors always have something right? Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to join you, Ambassador Yad, and my colleagues, and to have read the report and to think about these questions. I was struck by how much the report answers the charge from the featured speaker, Professor Harani, who really opened with sticking to the facts, right? And that's what we need to continue to do in speaking back to the various kinds of claims from all sides about migration across the world, but particularly with regard to Africa. And so the report, talks very much about facts, but one of the facts that really struck me, as it often does, but is it really in the report that I encourage you to read, is about the long history of migration in both of these, from both of these countries to various places, and detailing that history and what it looks like today is really fascinating and important.
Thank you, Dr. Laura Smith. Osaiji?
Well, first of all, I thought both aspects of the report were well written and well researched. Mm-hmm. I thought it was particularly interesting to see the question of how those who migrate, how they integrate in the countries that they migrate to. That tension between assimilation and integration is a very interesting one. And because in the report, you had a Francophone country and you had an Anglophone country, it actually goes back to the history of the colonial strategy that both types of countries experienced. So the British indirect rule system was not one that talked about assimilation. It was the French system that talked about assimilation. So I think that ultimately affects the orientation that those who emigrate have when they arrive in the host country. So those who come from Nigeria would never be thinking of an assimilation where you give up your culture, but they would be very comfortable with integration.
We could compare our own journeys. You from Nigeria, and me from Senegal to France, and you to the United States, right?
Completely different orientation. And I think
more in the assimilation stuff than you. That's what you were saying.
I don't know, but I thought it was very interesting that the report, was conscious of that difference and talked about it.
That's right. That's right. Andrew, president of the Migration Policy Institute.
I think two things. One, a small point, one, a big point. One is I think I want to highlight something Constance says in the report that in fact the African immigrant community in the United States is incredibly well educated. I mean, the last time we ran the numbers, which was a couple years ago, I think it was 48%, almost half of all African immigrants have a college degree. Now, not all working in their chosen profession, right? That's a different question because that's a big question in the US about how people with professions actually connect or not with their, whether they're able to get their titles recognized, their diplomas recognized, and be able to do it. But it is a well-off population. It's a self-selected population, right? To get from Africa to the United States, the legal pathways tend to be things that favor people with higher education. The second point, I think, is something that I think is big, and we heard from Professor Ran at the beginning as well, which is, we're going through a change in the world right now. It is not the extreme thing that you hear sometimes that, there's going to be people running across borders everywhere. That's not true. Most people who move actually within their own country, or they move to a nearby country, right? We know a majority of sub-Saharan Africans move to other countries in Africa. That will probably continue to be true. It's slightly different with North Africa. But, that is, people tend to move in smaller spaces. But we are going to see more international migration in larger chunks and larger distances. And it's as much about demand in some countries as it is about supply, right? I mean, it is about the doubling of the population in Africa, so that's where people will come from. But it's also because you have countries like Italy and Spain and Germany and Denmark that are reaching a point where their labor market's about to decline, or has started to decline in some cases. East Asia, parts of the Americas. and there's going to be a demand for workers. And Africa will be the place where there are the largest number of people coming of working age. But this is going to create mobility, whether we like it or not. And so we got to figure out how we create the legal pathways that make this happen in an orderly way, because it's going to happen one way or the other.
Andrew Dr. Lara-Smith, Andrew just mentioned the importance of the destinations in the neighboring countries and beyond. About the reasons why they move, would you like to, according to you, would you like to tell us about the reasons of these migrations, and do they have changed over the years? Because we hear a lot about climate migrants, refugees, economic migrants. We hear a lot of what are the main trends when it comes to Africa, what's going on about the evolution of these migrations.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and it's one that I think Amal's section does a really nice job of sort of pointing out that the sort of three main reasons that many migrants in the world move, and in this sense, Africans are no different than other migrants when they're thinking about the reasons that they may need to move, and again, the different types of movement that you've talked about within their country, across a border to a neighboring country, and further, are economic, education, and family reunification, right? And those are, at least for the last 150 years, and probably longer, although, sort of the way the world looked, we weren't thinking about the data in that way. But, right, people are moving because they need to care for their family for economic reasons. They need to provide for themselves and their family. Those are the economic reasons. They need to improve their educational opportunities, right? And that's a huge driver. And then family reunification. Somebody is somewhere else, and they need to be with them. They need to reunite their family. Those continue to be huge drivers. But the second part of your question is really important, because part of what my own research is about, and part of what we see more and more in the reports of the larger agencies like both UNHCR and IOM, right, is that it's really complicated when you scratch below the surface, right? When you talk to a migrant for a little bit longer than a minute, the first thing they'll say is, I need a job, right? But then you may find out that underneath that, they lost their land because of a political conflict, or because they face police brutality, or because they face interpersonal or gender-based violence, right? So the causes are often much more complex, right? And we see this in the Americas. It's definitely the case in the Mediterranean, but it's the case in other routes that we talk less about. Constance's report, I think, is really also important, and we haven't really highlighted it. And I think we could talk about it for Morocco too. But the fact that Nigerians are certainly in the United States, as we know about, and as I'm sure we'll talk more about, in the United Kingdom for that sort of historic connection, like Moroccans going to France for the former colonial power, but also to South Africa, right? And the drivers for much of that migration, right, are folks that are facing this kind of complex mixed migration, as we sometimes call it, of people who face political violence, interpersonal violence, and can't get further abroad, don't have these other kinds of resources of education and so on, but still need to get away. So there's many reasons, but they are interrelated.
Exactly. Osaiji, Lara just outlined very eloquently the reasons why people move, but behind the numbers, there are human beings with their own journeys of migration. How would you describe yours? Opportunities, challenges. Tell us more about you. Right now, you are an inaugural member of, like I said, the Presidential Committee for Diaspora Engagement. It has been set up right after the US-Africa Summit. Tell us more about yourself. How do you appreciate personally what our guest just said?
Two things. Just a courtesy to what Laura has just talked about. And she touched on it, but I think it's so important that we keep it into context, which is that this is the norm. I mean, when the Irish migration occurred into the US, what drove it? A major famine in Ireland, oppression by the British, political instability. This is the norm. And it's important to keep that in mind, because many times when we talk about migration today, we look at it from a political perspective, and there's this perception that, oh my God, Africa is falling apart, that's why people are migrating. And I'm like, nah, check your history. This is what happened in Europe. So this is the norm, and we really have to keep that in mind. You know, but to your second, the second part of your question, I think I'm probably the quintessential American, Nigerian American immigrant. All right, you know, it's. And the thing that I would first say that I think is very important that, again, we keep into perspective is this is the norm. In other words, my story would not be any different if I was in Lagos, or if I was in London, or if I was in New York. Why would it be any different? It's the same orientation. It's the same cultural focus. It's the same drives. Okay, so as I said, quintessential Nigerian American. Both parents were academics. So education. You know, I think your numbers were on the total African.
Yes.
Okay. On the Nigerian side, it's like 60-something% of all Nigerians in the U.S. Over 25 have a first degree, and I think in comparison, the average in the U.S. is just under 30%, and
matters a lot in migrant communities, right?
It's what is driving it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I said it's quintessential. And for me, by 24, I had 4 degrees from 3 different universities in 4 different countries. Okay. That's not out of the ordinary. I was in college at 14. I had my first degree at 18. Not out of the ordinary within my community in Nigeria. Okay. Came to the States, went to Penn, University of Pennsylvania, for postgraduate studies in law, and you know, ended up staying to practice law in the States, and ended up becoming a partner in Pricewaterhouse and corporate finance, and then ended up going through 6 different professions. Okay, again. That's the norm. That is the expectation within the community. That's the expectation that your parents had. And
is it the pressure?
It's interesting. It's only within the American context that you hear the word pressure. Within the Nigerian context, it was, what else are you going to do? Your grandfather had multiple degrees. What are you talking about? You know, I mean, it's so funny culturally. You know, in America we celebrate high school graduation. Most people in Nigeria are like, what? You're celebrating what? High school graduation? What's that? Okay. Did you get your PhD?
Yeah.
Oh, not yet? Okay. Yeah. All right. You know, so it's a completely different orientation, and ultimately, you know. I ended up, as I said, 6 or 7 different professions, but we are very eclectic in terms of the interests that we have. It's very, very common for Nigerians. It's very rare to meet a Nigerian that has one profession or one area. They have 4 different business cards.
Very flexible. Yes.
So that is my American story.
An American dream.
I think the American dream is very similar in many regards to the Nigerian dream, which is you want to be successful, both academically and economically. You want to have a community that supports you. You definitely are hyper-focused on what is happening with your children. There's this funny comedy that was on TV for a while, Bob Hart's Abishola, and it was pretty accurate as to the kind of focus and what drives that kind of community in that regard. So I think all those things were normal. I might say maybe the other thing, which goes back to my earlier comment about assimilation and integration, is that within again, this is broad generalizations are always dangerous, but for purposes of this discussion, within the Nigerian community, once people migrate to the States, they didn't do it to play. They did it to be very successful. So what is the result of that? The result of that is that you have Nigerians in major positions in the U.S. federal government, major positions in state governments. So politically, they're quite active.
Yeah.
The first African mayor of Colorado Springs happens to be a Nigerian. You see Nigerians very active in the academic world. Again, chair, a good friend of mine, Nelson Oyofiku, is chair of the neurological department at Chapel Hill. Bayo Gunlesi sold his platform for 18 billion.
Yeah.
So you see that consistent push across the board, because guess what? They're home. And they're going to do at home the way they want to do anywhere they choose to be home.
And speaking of home, we need to talk about the receiving countries, Andrew, because the success is driven by your own eagerness to succeed, right? Every migrant wants to succeed, but also a lot depends on the policies in the receiving countries, in the host countries. So, Andrew, how do you, or what is the role of these receiving countries? How do you appreciate their policies, and what differences do you see between the US and Europe, for example?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there's a real need, and I think we're all falling down on this in thinking about how we create the legal pathways. I mean, you know, and Osaki, I mean, what you said, I thought was very perceptive about, I mean, you know, you look at Italy, for example. Italy was Africa 100 years ago, right? I mean, we all think of big Italian families in this country. Italy has the second lowest birth rate in the world right now. But it was 100 years ago, right? It's the country people were leaving both because of conflict, but because the demographically children had stopped dying at an early age, which is actually a good thing. Medicine had gotten better, people had urbanized, had moved to cities, and so that you suddenly have people able to, you know, to survive, to enter the workforce and nowhere to work, and so they came to the United States and Argentina and elsewhere, right? So now, you know, this is gone. Sweden was there before, you know, later on you have other countries, right? Parts of Latin America, now Africa. This is, you know, the way the world has worked historically and always. So we should know we should learn from our past mistakes, first of all, which is we need to figure out how we build the pathways for people to come legally, because we're also in a world where, you know, people are going to have a little more agency than they used to because they have this. This is actually really useful. Turns out people who, you know, could only think about going to a nearby country, or maybe they thought about going across the Mediterranean to Europe, suddenly can think about the Darien Gap, right? Because they have information in real time that they didn't have at another moment. So if we don't think of how we order, so I think the first thing for receiving countries is let's figure out how we structure this, because it's a win-win if you can figure out how people can come legally in some sort of orderly way. It gets rid of the antibodies that you get of people pushing back against immigration. It makes sure people can move into the workforce quicker, can contribute, pay taxes. So number one. Number two, I think, is, you know, we need to think of our integration supports, how we integrate people in schools.
To the integration support, the wall, the U.S. wall at the border. Is it a solution?
I mean, look, I think you have to think about how you regulate migration. You need legal pathways, you need a protection system that works, and you need enforcement. So what I always say on the wall is, I mean, building a wall across the border makes no sense. But are there places that you need barriers? Sure, right? I mean, you know, we could debate whether the idea of a wall across the border, no. But yes, I mean, we have to also talk rationally about, if we're going to create legal pathways, also if people don't follow those, how do we deal with that, right? So no, I'm not a fan of the wall, but on the other hand, I think we also need a rational conversation. There are places where you do want barriers, right? I mean, you know, we want orderly migration, right? In the end, how do you organize things? So, but I do think we need to think about education systems, right? I mean, how do we make sure that children succeed? That's at everyone's benefit. How do we think about public services? How do we think about housing? And then we get into those things that I think the report does well on national narratives, right? Who's included? What do you have to do to be French or Danish, where my mother was from, or Mexican or American, right? And these are wrestling with. I'm not going to try and compare Europe and the U.S. because I will, you know, I don't want to misspeak on it. But let me say, I think countries. I think no country is perfect on immigration. I think all countries struggle with the notion of change. Let's face it, most people grow up, whether in receiving countries or sending, and most people grow up in small communities that change very little, right? You know,
how do you explain that two countries like France and the United States, immigration countries, are so stressed when it comes to migration today?
I think you have two things going. You have probably three things going. One is economic change, and I think people feeling insecure, though most of the studies tell us that immigration is not really a source of economic insecurity, but people don't know life is changing fast. Cultural change, I think, matters, right? I mean, people are dealing with their neighborhoods looking different, feeling different, their customs changing, the pace of change has certainly increased. And then I think there's disorder, and that's the one that there's more ability to control in the short term, which is, because that's how, then we have to think about how we find legal ways for people to come, because if we don't do that and we know they're coming anyway, then people are going to push back on the disorder, right? They're going to see people coming illegally, people coming without documents, so they're going to say, you know, this is out of control. That's the one I think where it tips from being a minority, a very vocal minority that is against change, to being a broader group of people who suddenly start embracing messages of reaction against immigration, but what they're really concerned about is the disorder part. Or even things that are simple, right? Disorder is sometimes in people's lives, it's not just the numbers of people coming across the border, it's also their kids' school, right? The fact that the city did not plan for, the federal government did not plan for the number of kids coming from a place, and the fact that they need some language instruction to be able to get in, and therefore their interpretation is the teacher is taking away time from my kid to help a kid who doesn't speak English, right, or French, right? But that's a question of planning. That's a question of countries being willing to embrace the change that they need, because frankly, people are coming to enter the labor market, right? Where there are not people from France or the United States still willing to work and pay taxes, right?
Lara Smith, a question about among these migrants, there is the phenomenon of brain drain. At a very moment when Africa needs its brains to develop itself, to transform its industry. How can we fix this paradox? And what do you think about those who are trying to give back through financial transfers, for example? How is it organized? Is it organized? What is your appreciation about this topic?
Well, thank you. I mean, these are excellent questions, and I think Nigerians are a phenomenal example. Nigerians in the United States and their organizational networks, which the report highlights, and certainly Moroccans in France as well. But really, all Africans in their various diasporas. So even those in the city giving back to their rural communities, those in countries right next door are giving back. So this huge number of Africans who are migrating across the continent. I think I really want to put a fine point on. I have a new edited volume that features African perspectives on this migration within Africa, and it actually focuses on Africans that go to Morocco. So other African, kind of bridging that gap between what we call sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. Morocco itself is a place for other Africans, as an important example. And those Africans are sending remittances back, even despite the tremendous precarity that they face. But the other thing that this migration provides is a sort of remittance of ideas and creativity. So we've got a couple of excellent great case studies, and there's great work being done about sort of entrepreneurial ideas that folks find, agricultural ideas. We've got Burkinabe who learn new agricultural ideas in Côte d'Ivoire and take them home to their home communities. So there's, I think, really much more that needs to be done to look at that can also sort of help us think more creatively. For sure, remittances are a huge part, and we need those kind of high value remittances. Governments need the foreign currency remittances. Communities and families use them, and they use them well. They use them for insurance purposes, for investing in their families and communities from European, American, and other countries. But also the value of the remittances and the ideas and creative flow from intracontinental movement of people is an important source, and one that will likely increase as other kinds of migration is going to increase and could be encouraged.
I remember Aliko Dangote, the richest man of Nigeria, who recently said that he needs 35 visas to travel in Africa, on the continent
itself. It's a huge,
so the Africa Free Trade Area, these new regional organizations, can they help to unlock the borders internally?
Absolutely. They absolutely can. And I think the other thing your report is important is Nigerians in South Africa, it's so much pressure, right? If you've just got a couple of regional hubs where folks are going to, like South Africa, which has long been a hub and faces its own kind of xenophobic backlash, much like the populist and far-right backlashes, right, that we see in Europe and the Americas, I would argue, because of the pressure of of jobs and so on in domestic
So
politics.
in South Africa,
Yeah.
you know, against Nigerians
Indeed,
or people,
indeed.
yeah, it was.
But if we really have a sort of push for free trade and a push for more visa openness, and think creatively about helping countries to, you know, kind of in support and facilitate movement between and among countries on the continent, as well as movement of funds, right? Remittances are extremely expensive to send, both from abroad internationally, but internationally within Africa, which is still an international remittance sending as well. So these are things to think about.
Osaji, the President's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement in the United States, what's your role exactly there? What is the goal of this group? What are you doing? What are your plans when it comes to the African continent, for example?
President Biden appointed, I think there were 12 of us, inaugural members, and the objective.
Newman is the chair.
Correct. And you know, the objective is for us to look at the interface and the interaction between Africans on the continent and Africans in diaspora, particularly with reference to the United States. So a lot of the things that we're talking about here is just right on point for what the council is supposed to be doing. And you know, we were involved in hosting President Ruto on his recent state visit to the U.S. There were a number of announcements made at the end of that with regards to education and educational initiatives. We are scheduled to do a trip, interestingly, to Nigeria next month, and that will also be an opportunity for us to have further discussions to see how we can enhance that relationship. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that is crucial, and I think, Laura, you touched on it, is the question of remittances, for example. Mm-hmm. In the case of Nigeria and the Nigerian diaspora in the U.S., the remittances from the U.S. amongst the Nigerian community is somewhere in the region of almost $20 billion. It is the largest amount of foreign inflow into the country after oil. It's roughly 7 times the value of all foreign aid that comes to Nigeria. So just putting that into perspective, this is a huge element. By and large, it's done through friends and family.
Yeah. It's not very organized by states.
So it's not particularly organized by states, it's not targeted. Now, the Nigerian government has made announcements recently of setting up a diaspora fund. And there are 1 or 2 initiatives there. One of them is a $10 billion fund that they've announced that they're going to target. So the numbers are becoming interesting. The impact could be quite profound, depending on how it's organized. And it goes to the question of this brain drain issue, because as Laura pointed out, you actually end up getting not just the foreign remittances of cash, but you also get new ideas coming back into play. And for those who are interested in a religious perspective, you almost think about what happened with Joseph and the consequences of the fact that he was forced to move from one country to the other, and the impact it had long term. So I do think that there are significant negative aspects of the brain drain, but I also think that there could be some positive aspects of it, depending on how it's managed.
Allow me a provocative question, but when we are talking of the diasporas, we are not talking anymore about migrations, right? And when it comes to diaspora, there's also the old diaspora, the African American community here in the United States. And we know that some of them, more and more, are eager to come back to the continent. Remember the year of return by Ghana. How do you appreciate the relations between the African immigrants coming here voluntarily and this old diaspora that is curious of its roots on the African continent?
3 quick comments on that. The first one, in the charging document that we were given as the Presidential Advisory Council, there was language in there that actually addresses that specifically says Africans on the continent, Africans in diaspora in the US, and African Americans who got to America as a result of the period of enslavement. I mean, it's actually in the charging document. So I think it's important to think about those three groups, because as is in the report that Constance said, there are differences that sometimes, if not managed properly, lead to stress. Okay, and I think that those differences can be ameliorated and really improved on, but you can't even start that if you're not conscious of the fact that there are differences. That's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, in many regards, okay, in many regards, the challenge that African Americans have and Nigerian Americans have, for example, is the challenge of communication. We've both learned about each other through the prism that was created by others. So if you ask the average African American, what is your first perception of Africa? Oh, they saw Tarzan. I guess Riceboro never stepped on the continent of Africa. He just made it up. If you ask most Nigerian Americans, what's your first reaction about African America? Oh, we saw Shaft. Okay, so we need to re-educate ourselves and
to learn more about each other
in real terms. And unless we start doing that, it makes it harder to have the kind of connection that you need.
Lara Smith, the African Union 6th region, do you know what it means? And if it makes sense, or if it works?
It's
the 6th region,
right? Yeah.
representing the diaspora.
Yeah, of course, yeah. It does make sense, yeah, of course it does. I mean, and actually, I mean, the African Union really needs to be the place that we go to and look to for leadership on this, right? They have taken leadership and they need to continue to. You know, one of my students I was talking to him from Durban, he's in Durban this summer yesterday, and he said, you know, when I look at the AU 2060, you know, Vision 2060, or what is it called? You know, but it's the 2060 report for the AU, you know, the continent is constantly looking forward, and we are always looking backwards, right? Sort of, what can we get back again? But when you're on the continent, right, this youthful continent is looking forward. The AU is looking forward, right? And that includes the diaspora. But you know, back again to this sort of you know, demographic trend, you know, migration trends. For me, these are really optimistic. There are great challenges there, but there are great opportunities, and I'm looking forward.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. My last question is for you. Before we wrap this up, among the migrants, there is a category of migrants that is very, very important, the refugees, the political refugees, such as in Sudan, for example, the largest refugee crisis in the world right now. What is your appreciation of the way these groups should be treated by the international community?
I mean, I think we need much more support for this. I think we need to recognize that also climate is another element. We don't want to call them refugees for reasons of international law, but that climate matters for people leaving as well. But refugees also do really well where they land, you know, and so actually figure out how we resettle refugees, how we allow the diaspora, by the way, to help resettle, because it's often diaspora groups that help bring people in. And if I could just add to actually what Osagie and Lara said, I think there's also ways of thinking about how the diaspora, I mean, we're talking about more remittances than development aid around the world right now, and more than foreign direct investment most years, right? Thinking about policies that help people invest in their countries of origin, right? I've been following this for personal reasons with some friends who are investing in Africa, and it's actually, you know, there's a huge appetite now that you have countries like Nigeria and South Africa and Senegal and Kenya that are growing for people to go back and actually make real investments, because it's both symbolically important for them, but also it's a way of making money, right? It's also actually a smart investment. You know, if governments could think of policies and international financial institutions, think about how you support that's already going on now, that could be a huge addition to many countries in their development efforts as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Osagie. It was a pleasure. This was a very impressive discussion, really. We have not covered everything, of course, because there's so much to say, but I'm sure the audience has appreciated this conversation. Thank you very much. And this last question allows me to transition to the next conversation we'll have about Sudan, an update on Sudan. Like I said, the largest refugee crisis in the world right now. So in a few hours, we will host Tirana Hassan, the new executive director of Human Rights Watch, who just released a report on ethnic cleansing in Sudan as a genocide started in the country. In the meantime, I would like to thank our audience for watching this important event, and thank again Amal and Constance for their remarkable report. Thank you, the Policy Center for the New South, for this very critically important partnership we have with the Atlantic Council, and see you soon. Bye.